Okay, so we're going to have to move something that was 45 minutes into 15. So I'm going to be jumping just to a few particular slides through this. The benefit being that the paper that we developed out of this research is available, and I think from this conference or else through our own website, impacttrust.org.za. You can download the whole paper there, and you can also download really this presentation in full form. But just really in the interest of time, to just go through some of the kind of key issues. And I think the first thing, Lisa, I think the first thing really I wanted to do is just jump my slides around and talk about terminology. And Flavio very nicely put down three sort of core points of, are we agreeing the terms of what we're speaking about? Do governments understand that? Clearly not from Minister Manuel's speech this morning. And are the supporting structures in place? Now, those three things you could almost understand as hierarchical. Actually, if we don't understand the terms, government isn't going to understand us either, and we're not going to put structures in place. And I think that was really an important part of the work that we've been trying to do, is what is a social business? We use the term social business. A lot of people use the term social enterprise. Specifically, we are talking about businesses that have a primary intent to deliver products and services that have a social, environmental, or both. So they are effectively triple bottom line businesses. They can be for-profit or non-profit, and I think this for me is the most essential thing. We keep talking about enterprising non-profits, and that's great and very important. But there is a new category of business, which is a for-profit business that still has that primary intent. And this comes back to, and another point, I think my colleague or past colleague Dylan is here from Greater Capital. Just want to clarify what is social investment and what is social stock exchange, because those are two different things as well. Social investment, unfortunately, is a term that South Africa used to define grant-making policy post-1994. If you go to Europe and you talk about social investment, it is financial investment in social purpose organizations. So there is already that contradiction we live with in a South African context. The Social Investment Exchange, SASEX, was a platform that was started by Greater Capital and that really looked at how to facilitate grant making. From there, it was pursued through a joint venture that Greater Capital, I established with Cadiz as Greater Capital, to look at financial investment, the true social investment. That was a financial investment in a social business. But the social stock exchange itself is specifically looking at social businesses. So it's looking at how can we have equity shares in these businesses that will give financial returns, and as well as their social profit. So I think these are the terms we've used. To the extent that social businesses are often also small and medium-sized enterprises, there is a very strong overlap in those two sections. And I think, I picked Susan's point earlier. She was saying government is really focused on SMEs. Actually, government is not focused on SMEs enough. And that's one of the things in the NDP that is looking at how do we actually support SMEs. A lot of people will say that SMEs in a developing world context are synonymous with high-impact businesses. The Andy Network, I see Max is here, talks about small and growing enterprises and really looks at the impact that those have. So there is some understanding of the difference here in terms of intent and purpose, but also that we need to recognize in developing world contexts, very often your small and medium enterprises and your social businesses are overlapping. The Small Business Corporation is a framework in a South African context, which is a policy framework that governs the tax and benefit or incentives around small businesses. Now, to be a small business corporation, you have to be or can be a cooperative or a private company or a CC, although there are no new CCs, but obviously the old CCs that were registered. You cannot be a non-profit to make use of the Small Business Corporation benefits. Okay, so that was, again, one of the points. So this is what we're talking about on a terminology level. I think one of the problems we have is so much atomization. Social stock exchange, according to Eunice, is make no profit, make no loss. If you invest 100 Rand today, in 5 years' time when you get your 100 Rand back, you have made a loss. So it's a highly problematic definition. And specifically if we're wanting people like Mark to put his investment money, our pension fund money, into something that is going to give us some kind of future. It may give us a better social environment, but it's not going to give us anything to live on. So those are, I think, some of the key issues that come up in the definitions around this, and I think that's important. I think this is one of the best understandings that we could say applies to. And so for me, to some extent, I'm speaking as if the SME framework and social economy are to some extent synonymous in terms of some of the challenges. They have the same challenges of startups and small businesses in many instances, even those enterprising nonprofits. But really that South Africa, the NDP recognizes that it needs small business, but it hasn't yet recognized that small business has needs. And what we've really been trying to look at is, to go back to what Flavio said, does government understand the definition, and then what can they put in place as a supportive framework for these? So just briefly, the research context, again, we all looked at South Africa. We are an oligopoly, basically as a country. South Africa's firms are the third. The recent World Bank report has come out to say you've got the third wealthiest, most profitable large firms in the world, South African large business. Pravin Gordon, I think, sat up last week at the Simadisa event and said that large business in South Africa does not want small business to exist. It doesn't. So you have the situation where there's a lack of dynamism, there's a lot of pushback, and there's also low risk-taking on the part of many large businesses. You also have a problem for small businesses, for social businesses, in terms of how do you get competitive in that kind of a framework. It's incredibly difficult. You're looking at lack of skilled management. You're looking at the whole young people, sort of youth unemployment, and also the workplace placement. So you've got these policies that are now coming out in terms of learnerships, which also don't actually support small business. If you're in a small business framework, you haven't really got the ability or the time to support somebody through their work placement. That is something that actually the larger firms should be doing. What a lot of the smaller firms are doing, and certainly through this research, is how do we get skilled management? How do we get benefit for growing employment of skilled management? And so one of our proposals, if you read the white paper, has been that there should be some kind of tax benefit for small businesses or social businesses that actually take on skilled employees, not the youth learners who are under the 150,000 Rand a year. You're wanting to get people who are high-level management who can actually help those businesses reduce the risk so that people like Mark will invest in them. So I think that really we're looking at this as a context. South Africa lagging behind pretty much almost any other country in the world that has a social economy. We don't have the definitions, we don't have the policy. Even our SME policy is massively unsupportive. What was really the purpose? Well, the purpose of this was actually to start getting some agreement on what is a social business in South Africa. Can we define it and put it into the tax policy? And then how do we look at that tax policy and create a more enabling framework? So coming back to Flavio, we exactly went through. Number one, can we agree the terms? Number two, do you understand this? And can you write it into your policy and then put the structures in place? So I'm not really going to go through this. And this, I think everybody understands, this missing middle that we talk about in developing countries. And the problem with this is that missing middle is exactly the place where you will have job creation. And so if we do not get that right, we are not going to address and solve the challenges that we face at the moment. In the social business landscape, I think we've all spoken this morning about how this has started. Look at the UK. Somebody mentioned France. France has some of the most amazing policy and legal structures available for social business, the solidarity businesses, as well as for SMEs that encourage both entrepreneurs and that encourage investors into those as well, giving tax benefits for investment, giving entrepreneurs benefits for loss. South Africa, we don't have that. There is very little support for an entrepreneur to actually get that initial capital formation, as well as for investors to actually, we have some of the worst, least enabling policies around venture capital. So the trend towards social business, I think this again speaks to what we were talking about earlier, these non-enterprising non-profits increasingly moving into these blended value small businesses, social enterprises. I think it's probably important here to say that, and speaking to the next panel that Brian is hosting, is that at the moment a lot of people are taking hybrid structures because grant money is still out there and easier to get, and impact investment money is incredibly difficult to come by when the profits are not high enough. And particularly where you have a high-risk environment as well. So Mark and I were talking about this earlier. I don't think there's enough money flowing because the returns aren't good enough. He will tell you it's also about risk, and we have to play both of these things. How do we reduce the risk, increase working capital for these social businesses or small businesses, and then actually try and unlock capital? I think, really, looking at what's happening in South Africa, so SMEs contribute about 40% of GDP, but employ 60% of the workforce. What is this terrifying number to me is that 94% of SMEs in this country employ less than 5 people. That is a micro-enterprise, okay? Of the 6% who employ more than 5 people, they are creating more than 26% more of the jobs. Now, SMEs are the only engines of growth in job and employment that we know of anywhere in the world. So, in fact, if we have in the NDP and in South Africa a desire to do inclusive growth, we have to find the way of how do we encourage SME growth. And by SMEs, I'm including social businesses, particularly because social businesses, I think, have a particularly inclusive focus of very much more broad-based in terms of both who they employ and who they serve. So this speaks to this slide where you can see here new and established business ownership rates. South Africa, for every 5 startups, you might get 2 established businesses. You look at Ghana, for every 11 startups, you're looking at 25 established businesses. That is a trend that we have to change in this country. And the only way we're going to change it is if we somehow provide better support structures to the startups for these organizations. And I think this comes down to what was the crux of the recommendations that we came out of these. One of them is capital formation for entrepreneurs. South Africa, and with all due respect to the budget, it is not a growth budget. We do not have. We keep selling it as a growth budget. It is not a growth budget. We have no ability to grow capital. As an entrepreneur, if you risk your friends, family, and fools' money, including your home, you have no write-off of that money when you've lost it. Trust me, I know. I've lost a few. You don't have, your savings is taxed. So why should I save? Actually, you then have a consumption process, loyalty programs. All of these things are increasing consumption. Consumption does not allow capital formation. Without capital formation, I think Minister Manuel spoke to it this morning, we're getting foreign inflows. Again, less inclusive development because we're having foreign investors in our companies. And why? Because none of us in South Africa, high cost of living, taxed on savings, are building up a savings pool that allows us to invest in businesses in our own country. And those are really critical, is how do we get household savings level up? How do we tax luxury goods, imported goods? How do we look at taxing things that are not benefiting the long-term view of building an inclusive, wealthy, prosperous country? So people at the moment are using employment not to save, they're using employment to fuel their consumption. We need to change that. We need to find a way. How do we reward savings? How do we actually get rid of dividends tax? How do we get rid of capital gains tax? Because actually, if somebody's risked their house, aren't they really able to have some kind of a benefit from that? So really we looked at how do we get better capital formation for entrepreneurs. The second thing we looked at was small business tax. Small business taxes, and I think there was a stat on the previous page, or it might have got lost in these shuffling my slides, but small business tax at the moment is particularly regressive. So it hits those smaller firms much harder than the larger firms. It isn't allowing those firms to get into the establishment phase. So really what we looked at is you will get more tax from a viable business. So why don't you sacrifice early stage tax? And this for me is particularly difficult to get through to Treasury, is you have we have 2 sort of categories of business, a small business corporation, which has tax-free income on 67,000 Rand. Now, if you're a small business and you're trying to get to above the 20 million and you're trying to get to above 5 employees, what is 67,000 Rand going to do for you? It's actually going to do nothing. So we've said, be bold, go to 1 million. If you speak to Chris Hart at Alexander Forbes, he'll say you should be going to 20 million. Okay, so there's obviously checks and balances. The fiscus has to earn something. But actually, if we want to create small businesses, we have to reduce that tax at the non-viable early stage, because that's what's putting business under. The third was really job creation, and we've made a very strong proposal on a incentive, a rebate or credit-based incentive for SMEs who employ skilled workforce. And I know we all talk about the youth unemployment rate, but I have to be honest, I don't know that many people, and I wasn't aware of this until doing this, of that silent unemployment of between 45 and 55. So you're having a lot of people in South Africa who have got significant skills, significant experience, who are getting unemployed because why? Well, they're too close to retirement age. We're not going to bet somebody who's turned 50. Heaven forbid, that's me. And so you have this silent growth of unemployment of highly skilled people. What if there was a way to encourage SMEs who are needing that skill? Susan spoke about it, social businesses needing the skill of business development, needing the skill of management. There must be a way, surely, that we can have the same kind of incentive to employ those people, because that is going to help businesses get through to the establishment phase. And I think the last one that we'd really spoken about, and which is now an ongoing conversation, and the second part of this research, is how do we create a more enabling environment for investment, particularly where there is some better recognition of the inclusiveness of that investment, the shared value, venture capitalists in particular, looking at if they take risks coming into it, how do they get benefits on the upside. So I think you'll see if you actually download this, we've gone through what all of the proposals are. We've even given a rationale. This is an interesting slide because this speaks to why we suggested 1 million. The businesses that fall under taxable income of 1 million makes up 83% of small businesses in this country. They only deliver 7% to the fiscus. It is not a big loss if you somehow actually allow that to be the stepping stone into the next really cadre, if you like, or cohort, as opposed to your top businesses. Only 0.1% of businesses are giving 40% of the revenue. Now, potentially, there's a way of actually not increasing their tax, but maybe putting their tax related to the number of learnerships that they have. So you want to get people to have work placement, put it in at big businesses where they can be contained, where they can be supported. There must be creative ways that we can look at these. And I think that those were really what we've been trying to engage with Treasury. And it would be very good to continue this conversation with the NDP, because I think that there are equity silos in government. We've had a very hard time getting to the DTI, who has to come on board if a social business category is going to be defined. Treasury and SARS have been very positive, but of course you then have to also include National Planning Commission and others. So these are conversations that are ongoing. So really this was the tax incentive to grow a permanent skilled workforce, essential for small and social businesses. Tax exemption on capacity grants. I think this is something that anybody who's got a hybrid structure will know. So if you have been brave enough to become a for-profit social business and you get a grant from USAID of 3 million, you're paying tax on that because that goes directly to your revenue line. So even where you have people who are trying to support your capacity building and your initial stages as a social business, you're being taxed on that. It's far better that you go into the non-profit format. A lot of people who are in a non-profit format could probably earn their own keep, as opposed to the charities who couldn't even necessarily be enterprising. So there is a need to somehow tease out the different components of this. This was one of the proposals. And then obviously here on how do we create the social business category. I think this is essential, and I think if there's anything this symposium can do to get agreement for, even just for the greater good, on how do we do a starting point of what is defined as a social business, because there is too much. Somebody said to me that if you're not in the financial services for money, you're in the social business sector for prestige and recognition. And there needs to be a sort of like a changing of that you need to be in it for the greater good to some extent. There needs to be an ability to collaborate. I think there has been so little collaboration in this sector, so much competition, so much fragmentation, and that's why, frankly, Minister Manuel seems to equate social business with a cooperative and a non-profit. And that's just defeating the whole purpose of what we're here for. So, so that's very quickly. Trying to keep in mind and handing over to Mark. But any questions, please, you can also email me on this research. Thanks.